Welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sarah Gillooly, and I'm the Vice President of State Outreach and Engagement here at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Welcome to our third installment of AU's Summer Series, where every Tuesday in June at 3 p.m. Eastern or 12 p.m. Pacific time, we're bringing you AU experts along with special guests from across the movement for separation of religion and government to talk to you about timely subjects. And today we're really excited to be bringing you Dr. Sabrina Dent and three very special guests who will be talking about religious freedom as a social justice issue. At AU, we believe that separation of religion and government is essential to protecting our freedom to practice any religion or no religion at all, so long as we aren't harming others, because that is the religious freedom found in the Constitution. And so today's topic of religious freedom as a social justice issue will really weave together some important and timely conversations. So before we get started today, I wanted to point out a few tech features to make sure that everyone has a great experience. If you would like to chat with other participants or just share a piece of knowledge, please do so in the chat box. I'll be in the chat box for the whole webinar, chatting with folks and sharing information. If you would like to ask a question of our panelists, you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and type your question there. At the end of our webinar today, we'll go to that chat box or go to the Q&A box and ask questions of our panelists. So I'll be coming back at the end when we get to Q&A and questions and answers. But until then, I want to turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Sabrina Dent.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much, Sarah. And good afternoon to everyone that's joining us for today's AU Summer Series on Zoom and Facebook Live. For the last 2 weeks, we've looked at religious freedom through a particular lens of history and even the challenges of religious freedom when held hostage by privileged religious groups. Today, we will explore the topic religious freedom as a social justice issue, featuring three incredible panelists. But before I introduce our panelists, I would like to remind everyone that today's discussion is an entry point into a larger, courageous conversation that needs to happen in the public square and around our dinner tables. So with that, I want to set the table for us today. 2020 has already been a monumental year of tragedy, triumphs, milestones in our history. Beyond being in the midst of a global pandemic due to COVID-19, we have seen the cries for humanity in the wake of the tragic deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Dominique Fales, a Black trans woman, and so many other more names that we can name, through the public proclamations that Black Lives Matter. This year is also Census 2020, when communities will push to have their residents self-report about household demographics with the intentions of securing government funding for their public school districts and their city budgets. Not to mention the power of this year being an election year. That is when politicians will publicly make promises appealing to racial and religious minorities about the economy, healthcare, women's reproductive rights, climate change, and a host of other important issues. Although these same groups are disproportionately impacted by criminal justice reform, race relations, immigration, education, and economic inequalities. And these are all critical topics that pertain to religious freedom in America. So I would say that today's program, Religious Freedom as a Social Justice Issue, is actually birthed from historical and current realities that have been shaped by Supreme Court decisions, state policies, laws about human rights, citizenship, the right to live, and even to love. So as we begin this program, I want you to remember that tomorrow marks the 5th anniversary since the tragic events that occurred at Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, when the lives of 9 innocent people were taken by the hands of a lone white supremacist. the lives of Cynthia Hurd, Susie Jackson, Ethel Lant, DePayne Middleton Doctor, Clementa Pinckney, Tawanza Sanders, Danielle Simmons Sr., Sharonda Singleton, and Myra Thompson, who were exercising their right to religious freedom to practice their faith in their house of worship, similar to those of their African ancestors who were also, as early as 1619, brought to America and ripped from their homelands. And they were stripped of their religious identities and cultures in ways that will historically be noted to have over 36,000 slave voyages to take place. That is transporting 12.8 million humans from West Africa to disperse them among Asia, Europe, the Americas, and the Caribbean. And I would say that their lives, just like the lives of the 9 people taken, are significant and their stories must be told. Just like the life of Babir Singh Sodhi, the Sikh man who was murdered after 9/11, he must also be remembered. So during the next 40 minutes, I invite you into a conversation thinking about the question, what is my responsibility in addressing the moral injury of religious discrimination and religious freedom for some in America? So friends, I invite you to listen for understanding while remembering that our panelists will be speaking from their perspectives as religious and racial minorities in America, who are also advocates for social justice and change. So with that, I would like to introduce my incredible panelists for today. So we have first with us Victoria Hamilton. She is a native of Louisville, Kentucky. She is a member of Sokai Gaikai International, which is a lay Buddhist organization where she is a practitioner and an activist. We also have Tahil Sharma, who is the regional coordinator for United Religions Initiative North America. He is a native of Southern California, and he was born into a Sikh and Hindu family. And then we also have Charles Watson Jr. Charles serves as the Director of Education at the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, and he is a native of Millen, Georgia. So with that, I say welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us today. So I would like to start by asking the question of the 3 of you. Tell us more about yourselves and tell us, how do you enter into this conversation about religious freedom as a social justice issue? And we'll start with you, Victoria.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Sabrina, and thank you so much, Americans United, and everyone who's joined us today. Like Sabrina said, I am a native of Louisville, Kentucky, in the American South, and I'm also a 3rd generation practicing lay Buddhist. So it was definitely made for a very interesting and sometimes very shameful, or I could say even a guilty existence. I felt like I had to hide who I was in conversation, in social situations, really in every single situation. I felt like I was constantly living in fear because of childhood traumas experienced at the hands of neighbors who really didn't understand and didn't really seek to understand how my parents practiced, their religious traditions and the way that I was being reared. And it took quite a few years for me to really accept and really claim this faith tradition as my own, but and that was after many years of really seeking to understand others as well, the context of really understanding my own much better. So it wasn't until my teen years, but since that time, I've continued to really practice my faith every single day through faith practice and study, and then continue to dialogue with peers and colleagues to help understand their religious traditions, or whatever their faith, their understanding of faith and how it informs who they are as people.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you for sharing. Tahil, would you like to jump in and tell us about yourself?
Thank you so much, Sabrina, and thank you to Sarah and the folks at AU for hosting this important conversation and giving me the privilege to share this platform with such amazing colleagues. I come into this space, as you had mentioned, with a dual religious background. I'm Hindu and Sikh. I'm a 1st generation Indian American with immigrant parents that came from the north of India. They came here with their privileges and opportunities to earn a better living for themselves and their extended families. And it actually informs a deep part of why I take an appreciative knowledge of other communities, whether they're ethnic, religious, or political in their attitudes and upbringings, because I didn't understand what role my dual religious identity would have until the August of 2012, when a white supremacist attacked a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. Being educated in Southern California, acknowledging the hyper diversity that exists here, meant that I was so used to the fact that we live in a pluralistic society. It wasn't the same reality that we were facing in the United States in this current moment, but it was also actually not understanding of the history and the current implications of how white supremacy is so deeply rooted in our traditions and our experiences here. And in the past 7 years of doing this activism work, I continue to look back and think about the ways in which my community has benefited from the privileges of coming here freely for the practice of opportunity, what we consider that model minority myth. And it was something that I told a friend of mine in DC several years ago, that if it were not for the enslaved Africans that were brought to the United States, who toiled along with the indigenous communities and were killed by the millions, my family would not have the privilege of being able to be here and to have the success that they have. I would not have the privilege of existing without their struggle and without their strife for justice. It was civil rights that allowed so many of the opportunities that my parents now have in getting to become a green card holder and American citizens. And that continues to inform, I think, the justice work that I get to do and the racial justice work that I emphasize in this current moment.
Thank you so much, Tahil. I appreciate you sharing your story, as well as Victoria. Charles, we'd like to hear from you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, and thank AU and the panelists for being a part of this. I come into this conversation and I want to do it as a list. And that list starts with being a male, which recognizes my male privilege. Come into this conversation with 2 degrees. I come into this conversation as a veteran. I come into this conversation as today I'm a Baptist Christian humanist. I come into this conversation as a heterosexual. I list all these things that you might not know about me, but for this conversation, and I think most importantly, I come into this conversation as what America sees me as, a African-American Black male. And that is the context in which I will have this discussion today.
Thank you so much, Charles, Victoria, and Tahil, for helping to shape, the discussion and how we enter into this conversation. And I think it's very important that we do that. A lot of times people engage in topics without thinking about everything that the person is bringing with them. And so since we're talking about religious freedom, I just want to hear from you. How do you define religious freedom? We know constitutionally that religious freedom allows for everyone to have the right to freely practice, without government interference, without discrimination, and that's extended to people of all religions and none. But many times we see a different narrative of what we see in the public square and the conversations that happen. Even just thinking about the victory that was won yesterday on behalf of LGBTQ rights, right? So, but when you think about religious freedom, how do you process that in terms of your being, your humanness, and then also within your religious identities? Can you share more? And Charles, you can jump right on in.
All right. I think about religious freedom from the idea that God did not create us as robots. God gave us the opportunity to serve, not serve, believe, not believe, have a faith, not have a faith. And if God gave us that privilege and gave us that ability, then the government should never step in and take that away from us or say that we have to have a faith. Our laws are secular. Our people can be religious. They have the choice to be religious or not be religious. And I think that's the big picture of religious freedom. And for me, it also entails full citizenship, meaning, and this is not a statement about immigration and that, but if I'm going to be an American citizen, I have to have every right that every other American citizen has. And so I want that for me, but I know that rests upon me also making sure that is the case for every other citizen here. And so it's an equal balance with that.
Does anyone else want to weigh in? Speaking of which, go ahead, Victoria, if you wanted to weigh in on that. Tahil, I want to mention that I know you wrote an article about the crocodile tears of religious liberty, right? Can you tell us more about that? And what was the precipitating moment for you to make you say, I need to write about this? This is an issue that needs to be addressed from my experience and my context.
Absolutely. Thank you for mentioning that. The inception of that article started up when the mention of the Johnson Amendment was going to be struck down, which sort of allowed for folks who may not know, the Johnson Amendment is something that limits tax-exempt religious institutions from being able to specifically focus on taking political stances. And the Trump administration trying to strike that down through an executive order still tends to be a muddy conversation, among other things. But more importantly, there was always this point about religious freedom versus liberty. And the differentiation that needed to be made was every time religious liberty was mentioned, it was at the expense of infringing on the rights of others and taking those rights away from them. We look at this with the Hobby Lobby case on abortion. We look at this with the gay couple that tried to get a cake from a shop. We look at this from a lot of the Supreme Court cases that we just heard a ruling from yesterday too. That this idea of religious liberty as an opportunity to deny, belittle, and dehumanize others is not religious liberty, it is supremacy. It is an attempt to make sure that only one tradition, one community, and one people are allowed to dictate what can and can't happen. And that's not what we're striving for. This is why we emphasize the point of freedom, something that is a historical precedent, even in the context of the framers, who were slave owners, who were dehumanizers, who exploited people, and yet still had this idea that diversity of religion is a part of our breath and blood. And it continues to be practiced today in the attempt of putting them as on this pedestal that continues to infringe on people. And the fact of the matter is we need to take a step back and explore that pluralism more in depthly in terms of Supreme Court cases and social conditioning.
So I think it's important that you brought that up. So since you went down that road, we'll travel down that road a little bit more. And I'm thinking about how Charles said citizenship, right? You talked about citizenship, Charles, and the importance of citizenship. And I mentioned it earlier in my comments. And then also you, Tahil, you talked about this notion of freedom, right? And then also this notion of religious freedom. So we know this week, the African Americans will be observing Juneteenth, which is a celebration of freedom that marks when enslaved Africans in Texas were then made aware that they were actually free. And so, and that's from 1865. And so when you talk about the founding framers and you talk about how there was this fight for religious diversity and religious inclusion with the exclusion of human freedom for some, and the idea of citizenship, how it evolved in the United States over time, and even what it meant to be citizen was also tied to your ability to vote. Like, what is it? Can we talk about this a little bit more in terms of this notion of freedom? Victoria, I would like for you to weigh in on this. I mean, in your community, how do you all talk about freedom? How do you all talk about religious freedom? Is that a topic that comes up? Are there church-state issues that intersect in this that come up in the Buddhist community?
Thank you so much for that question. Being an international organization, with the organization that I practice just being one member organization inside of an organization that exists in 192 countries and territories, it always respects the local traditions, laws of wherever it finds itself. So here within the United States, members can practice freely, gather freely, speak with others about our faith, invite others to participate in dialogues and discussions, regardless of what their tradition or none may be. But when it comes to, you know, day to day, I think it's really about faith is everyday life. So that's the framework that we really, I believe, and I can speak to from my own personal experience. My religious tradition informs who I am and how I appear in the world and how I interact with other people, being that I don't hide behind it. I don't say I'm Buddhist and therefore I'm perfect. I say I'm Buddhist and therefore I'm trying. I'm trying to engage in this process of human revolution, this inner transformation inside of myself. So if we believe in also this concept of oneness of self and environment. So if I'm looking at my environment, whether it's my work environment, whether it's my family, whether it's whatever else I place I appear, and if I'm looking at it like this is a mess, then I really see it as my own personal determination, my own personal mission to engage in dialogue and also the transformation of that space, and also but by first starting with the transformation of my own heart and my own mind. So like, how can I really stand shoulder to shoulder with the other people with whom I find myself in this space as part of my own personal mission? How can we move forward together, not just me being happy, but happiness on the level of absolute versus relative? Whether I have what I need and you don't, is my own happiness then like really more shallow than anything? Is it, you know, how can it really be happiness if others around me are really struggling? So in whatever sense that appears. So it's not like a mandate, but it's really this belief that our happiness or our freedom or our liberty or whatever we define as what we need to really move forward and to progress, it can't really be extricated from the happiness and the freedom of others. So, you know, it really respects the dignity of all human life, and not from an all lives matter and some don't kind of perspective, but really seeing the inherent dignity of each person's life and making them aware of it, as we also, you know, really seek to understand the depths of the humanity that also exists, you know, from time without beginning in our own life. So a deep respect for others as well as for ourselves.
So I talk about this deep respect for others. You mentioned some keywords that I think are critical to this conversation. You talked about the personal responsibility and personal determination, but also this responsibility to community. You also said the word transformation, which is so important. So I want to get into the question, like, what is social justice, right? So I looked it up because we had our conversation, the four of us. You know, Charles was like, Sabrina, I need you to define social justice. And so if you Google social justice, it says that social justice defines, it defines social justice as justice in terms of the distribution of wealth and opportunities and privileges within a society. And also further research highlights that there are 4 elements to social justice. That's equity, access, participation, and rights. So even as we reflected on some of the things that historically have come about when we're talking about religious freedom, this all intersects. So for the purpose of this conversation, I said, well, let me weigh in and give my definition of social justice. I said, I define social justice as an act of reimagining and dismantling systems of oppression that have served as mechanisms to determine who has value, access, and the right to access resources, services, or wealth in this country. And so like last week, there was this powerful video that came out by Kimberly Jones, who was talking about like systemic oppression here in the United States. And this was on the heels of some of the riots that were taking place. And so can we speak to this issue of social justice? Why is it important that we talk about social justice within the framework of religious freedom? So Charles.
since I asked for the definition, you want me
Yes,
to?
sir. We'll go there.
Um, I'll talk about it in the framework of how I try to see it. You know, I describe myself as a Baptist Christian humanist. And one of the things I've always taken from Christianity was the least of these mentality. And so I have always been astonished that we have Christians in America that don't understand Black Lives Matter or don't understand social justice, when we're saying the least of these is who Jesus was saying we should be helping. So if we have an opportunity to help the least of these in this situation, I don't care who that least of these is, that's social justice. That's going into whether it's wealth, whether it's distribution of wealth, whether it's people that are not able to have the same freedoms. We should always be trying to do something for the least of these. And at some point, some of us all may end up being the least of these, and we just wrap back around and grab them and pick them up and let's keep going forward. But this idea of something that social justice is, and again, I'm speaking to the Christians out there, the idea that social justice is not a part of the faith, or that social justice is not what Jesus was talking about, it baffles me. So that's me thinking about it in just the Christian context. But in the context of just being a citizen again, or somebody that says they're American, that would be the whole context of being American to me, having freedom. You can't have freedom if everybody isn't free. And if we see somebody isn't free, then we should be fighting for their freedoms, and especially if I have it. Because I know if you take it away from them, eventually it's going to come back to me. So social justice is ingrained in who I am, and it wraps into religious freedom for me, because I have to have that ability to call myself whatever I want to call myself in the religious context. And so social justice helps me in that way, and that touches all of it. I'm glad you grabbed that definition, because it makes people understand it's not just a one single issue. It has layers to it, and we have to touch every layer in order to make sure that we are fighting for social justice.
Absolutely. Tahil, yes, please.
I think based on the definition that you sort of gave us, in the way that my traditions form me personally, it means I literally have to remove the words them and other from my vernacular. For me, a reflection of how others are treated is a reflection of me. Because I come from two traditions that say that the light of the divine exists in all things. And if I diminish and I put out the light of others, I'm hurting the light of God that's within me. And that is the height of audacity. It is the height of arrogance for me to assume that my light and my self-importance is above the dignity of others. And from the Hindu and Sikh perspectives of recognizing the entire universe as your family and service to God being service to all of humanity, it puts me in a really strange place when I have many people from my own religious and ethnic communities pushing out the same anti-Black narratives that might either be informed by the white supremacy of colonialism or living in the United States, or that might be an interpersonal interpretation of religious texts and traditions that are not just informed by race, but are informed by color, by caste, by creed, and by socioeconomic status. And as a South Asian, having to tackle all of those things at once, when trying to tell a community that we have to dismantle our anti-Blackness, when we have billion-dollar corporations trying to bleach skin and make it lighter and brighter and whiter, when we have systems that allow folks to come to the religious conclusion or justification that they can never go above their caste or they cannot marry outside of their caste, or to have the audacity to say that your skin color is what will define your future, what will define your past, and what will define your present, is something that is so hard to deconstruct and so generationally inherent that it comes off as insulting to me that these people can call themselves Hindus or Sikhs or South Asians. And for me, I think it kind of draws to the point of mentioning the idea of Black Lives Matter, that all Black lives matter. That for me as a South Asian, I have nothing but pride in saying, because all lives cannot matter if Black lives don't matter. We all are in consensus with this, in this room at least. I may not be able to speak for other people who might be listening in. But if there are other folks within your own community who are carrying these sentiments and these assumptions and these ideologies that put them in a place of more importance than others, you really have to go back and dismantle that, because this is not just about a single kind of supremacy we're talking about here. White supremacy, it might be our particular or an international phenomenon, but there's so many other kinds of supremacy that come into play that we have the responsibility to go back into our communities and fix and dismantle as well.
Right.
Till,
So,
Sabrina, I'm sorry, but
go ahead. No, go right ahead, Charles. Mm-hmm.
And it talks about social justice, and it talks about, Tahil, what you're describing is what we need. We talked about it a little last week, and I just have to be honest with you. To me, all America understands is criminal. The context of things has to be in criminal, whether it's, protests or the rioters or looters. The only thing they can see is criminal, even though this country was birthed off of riots. I mean, Boston Tea Party was a riot. So I tell people now, people say they're allies. This allies thing is getting to be weak. I need accomplice, and so when we talk about this, I need somebody that's willing to go and get in trouble with me. An ally can decide, oh, I don't want to be an ally this day, or I do want to be an ally this day. There's somebody that's an accomplice that's going out there and going to fight with me for my rights. And if something is going on with me, they're going to say, you know what? When I get arrested or when something happens to me, they're also going to get punished too. We need more people that want to be like that, and we have to be like that for each other. In every one of these social justice issues, we need accomplice. We don't need allies anymore. Allies is not going to get it done, and that's what you see this generation moving to see. And people that are not in this younger generation, we need to learn from that. We need to learn that aspect of, no, if you're really serious and you're really going to do it, you got to get out there and actually take the brunt of it. I've said it before, and it's been said a long time. A lot of people in this country love Black culture, but they take it off when something else, violence is going toward them, or we have something moving toward us that they don't agree with. If you're going to love the culture, you got to love the human being that the culture is from. And if you don't love that, leave the culture alone too. Again, be accomplice with us, not allies.
Right. Absolutely. Charles, I completely understand what you're saying, as well as Tahil. It's important that if you're going to be an accomplice in this work, and if you're going to say you want to be an advocate for religious freedom and justice, that you consider the full humanity of every person that impacts. So when you talked about the layers, right, immediately I thought about, what does that look like for someone that may be a racial minority, a religious minority, who also might be a part of the LGBTQIA community, right? And how we have to fight for their rights and the fullness of their humanity. So on that vein, I want to know, what are your organizations doing to address issues? Because we talked a lot about, as someone put in the chat, the philosophical things, but I want to hear about the practical things that are happening. I know, Victoria, the work that you're doing with the Lions of Justice, and then Charles, there's work that you're doing with Christians Against Christian Nationalism. So can you talk a little bit about that, Victoria? Can you talk about the work that you're doing? And Tahil, I definitely want to hear about some of the work that you're doing with URI.
So thank you, Sabrina. There is an ongoing part of, I think for some people it might sound like weak sauce, for some people it might sound pie in the sky, but I think that in gathering in small groups, community-based groups, all kinds of people from different religious traditions prior to even exploring Buddhism. So everyone comes with their own lived experience to these bi-monthly community gatherings by neighborhood, where we explore all kinds of different topics and our lived experiences and what's going on in society. We never shy away from what's going on in society, what's going on in our own lives, realizing that they are inextricably linked. So we have study meetings, we have discussion meetings, and that's always been the lifeblood of the organization from its beginnings in pre-World War II Japan, when the militarist government was trying to shut down these organizations and shut down these community-based conversations that were philosophical in nature, but were also grounded in the reality of what was going on outside. So it's just like, how can you go and into those spaces where you're fighting for your humanity if you don't really feel like you're a whole human being, or you don't even see the dignity of your own life or the life of others? So that still continues. So it continues with those community-based bi-monthly conversations, but also what comes out of that. I mean, it's not just like we're going to go out and we're going to do canned food drive. That's wonderful. But like, how else are you going to do it? How are you going to stand up on your own 2 feet and gather with others? So you mentioned the Lions of Justice gathering that we had 2 years ago in 9 different American cities. It brought together 50,000 young people to stand up for the dignity of human life. How were they doing that? They were, having dialogues with other people in their communities. They were having dialogues with coworkers, families, family and friends, really engaging in their own human revolution, and really even exposing people to the possibility that their own life has enough value and enough purpose that they can impact those circles where they find themselves. Right now we're engaged in the One Youth Infinite Hope campaign, the same thing. So engaging not just adults, but people of all ages, creeds, sexual orientations, however they enter the conversation, to really realize the dignity that is within their own life. Because I think that when people constantly see themselves as the other, they constantly see themselves as marginalized people, they constantly see themselves from a position of lack or of want, like the conversations that they enter into, the things that they do, their thoughts, words, and deeds are going to reflect that, right? They're going to come from a place of fear and of lack and of wanting. So if you come from that place of lack and wanting, you'll never have enough, right? But if you really see what's within your own life and the power that it has, then you start to enter the conversation and you start to act quite differently. So I think just awakening people to the dignity of their own life is a crucial part of the conversation, and a crucial part of the movement towards social justice, that it begins with one person awakening to their own great potential, right? So you think of all of the great movers and shakers, they were just one person who inspired so many other people within their realm of influence. So inspiring that in people of all ages, in our families, our communities, workplaces, etc.
Thank you, Victoria. Charles, can you tell us a little bit about the work with Christians Against Christian Nationalism?
Yeah, we started this campaign a couple years ago. Basically, the easiest way to describe it is, we saw that many times when things happen, terrorist attacks or things happen in the United States, it was always, hey, this group, you need to speak out against the people that are doing these things. But when it came to domestic terrorism, or the things that white Christians or evangelicals under that hide behind white supremacy were doing, Christians were silent. And so we said that, no, we can't do that. Actions of Dylan Roof at Mother Emanuel Church, we can't be silent about that. So we have to be, Christians Against Christian Nationalism says that it makes sure that people are not trying to marry the 2 things together. Those 2 things are, you have to be a Christian to be an American, and in order to be a good American, you have to be a Christian. Those 2 things are separate. Christians don't have the corner on being patriotic. And so we make sure that we have Christians Against Christian Nationalism to make sure that there's no place for hiding of white supremacy behind the Christian faith. And so we call that out. The other thing that we've been able to do, we started last October with our special committee on race, just to make sure we study the past here at BJC, to make sure we don't make the same mistakes that have happened. And so that committee has been working, looking at things that happened during the civil rights era, but also just how our organization came about and what that means for the future. And we plan on doing some actions after that. And, just promotional, it just so happened next Friday, June 26th at noon, we're going to have a BJC luncheon. Everybody's invited to it. And we're going to have author Robert Jones and political analyst Joy Reid actually talk about his new book, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. And so for us, that's a time to, let's attack this, let's break this down. Let's break that wall that provides protection for the people that are hiding behind this Christianity in order to not have religious freedom for everybody, and to actually hide and show white supremacy for what it is in all those ways.
Right. And Tahil, can you tell us a little bit about what's happening at URI? And then we're going to go to some questions. I see there are lots of questions in the Q&A.
Definitely. So one of the campaigns we're currently working on right now is URI Gives Breath to Voices, which is a campaign we created with the hashtag URI for Black Lives. We created an interfaith hub that allows for people to understand the need for bringing up and engaging in conversations of race in the interfaith movement. And particularly taking those conversations back to your own communities, as we want people to see resources, stories, and have opportunities to really look at why there is a moral urgency behind the interfaith movement being a part of the conversation on racial justice. So we are looking to collect stories from around the United States, Canada, and Mexico to really see how anti-Blackness is being addressed, how conversations on race are being addressed, and more importantly, how people are actually acting on the ground to work towards that justice. We, in working on this hub, want to make sure that people have access to reading lists, to videos, to sermons, to photos, and to graphics that really put us out there in saying that as a part of the interfaith movement, no matter my worldview, it is morally urgent for me to address and be vivid in saying that Black Lives Matter, because it is an imperative for us in practicing religious pluralism and religious freedom to make sure that we strive for those who are in need. And there is no other way around that. The second thing that I want to share is that we are doing a partnership with PBS through their Visionaries program, which is a series of documentaries that have been going on for the past 25 years, where they are going to be featuring a documentary on the work that we've been doing around the world. And some of this programming is in relation to this conversation because we are trying to address the point of interconnectedness when it comes to transnational and domestic issues. And the cooperation that we're seeing in examples of cooperation circles or our member chapters working on the ground in places like West Africa and South India, we are trying to contextualize the conversation of being a part of a global network of communities that are working for justice. And how does it put into context our need to have more of that groundswell here locally to address global problems like white supremacy, hegemony, prison and military industrial complexes, and other stuff like that that we often ignore as elephants in the room when we don't want to address them. So we have that opportunity to show that documentary on hundreds of PBS stations, but we'll also have people ready to sign up to be able to host their own virtual screenings and stuff.
Great, thank you all for sharing. I mean, that points to some of the questions that are in the Q&A there, Sarah. So if you want to lead us into the Q&A.
Yeah. A couple of questions that have come up around what it means for religious people to serve in government, and when our commitments to social justice might be rooted in one's religious morality, how do religious people serve in government in a way that preserves the separation of religion and government? So there's an interesting question here about personal practice versus public policy, and I'd love to hear our panelists grapple with that a little bit.
Sure. Charles, is that an indication that you want to jump right in?
I was just unmuting, but
okay.
First of all, I believe that people of faith should be in the public square and should be serving. I think separation of church and state doesn't mean you are not still a citizen and you're not still able to be a part of the political process. All you have to do is understand that just because something is of a religious preference to you doesn't mean you have the right to then put that religious preference on every other person in the United States. I would love to see people that believe in, I'll just use my faith tradition, and I'll keep going back to the least of these. I love to see people that believe in the least of these. Did you visit the prisoner? Okay, that to me, that sounds like criminal justice reform. That means, hey, how long have they been in prison? Why did they go to prison? Why is this person in prison longer than this person for the same crime? So I want people of faith to be a part of those decisions that are made, as long as they don't put their faith over anybody else's faith. That's the only line that should cross, because you know, we've had that in the African American community for a long time. Adam Claypool Powell was a representative. You have, you know, I love Representative Keith Ellison, who brought his faith into that. You know, so having a faith tradition or having a religious tradition and going into the public square, there's nothing wrong with that. And those that are humanists or those that are atheists, I want them into the public square too. There's no discrimination. You know, Article 6 says there's no religious test for those who try to run for political office. Now, unfortunately, that may mean some people won't vote for them because of the religious faith. And I'm gonna get on my soapbox just for a second. If you're voting for somebody just because of their religious faith, you have to think about that for a second. I mean, I used to work in the hospital as a chaplain in Children's Hospital, and if a child was about to have surgery, I never had a parent come up to me and say, hey, is that surgeon Christian or is that surgeon Hindu? All they want to know is how many times that surgeon had done that surgery and how successful are they. They can go to their own place and pray for it, but they didn't care about it. And so I think we need to bring that into the political square too. Like, yeah, you can say you Christian, you can say you Hindu, but your actions mean more to me than your, oh, I'm Christian, oh, I'm this.
I definitely want to jump on that, because I think it's absolutely right. There's a difference between pushing for infringing on others and creating a supremacy versus having accommodations for those who might be practicing to be able to enter these spaces. Whether we look at it from the context of the halls of Congress, when Representative Ilhan Omar caused a controversy by walking into the halls of Congress with her hijab on, which some people took to be as an infringement on others, which personal practice versus implying whatever rules that they think are caused by that is very different. The accommodation in workspaces, in political offices, and in our daily life to be able to allow people their freedom of belief and personal practice is very different from using that kind of logic and narrative to actually, you know, invest in putting up a 10 Commandments statue in front of your state house. It's the difference of having, you know, just Christian prayers to open up your agendas. There are very clear differences in having accommodations versus narratives of supremacy, and we need to continue thinking about that when we think about those that serve in the public square too, because we are informed by our upbringings and by our worldviews. And if you think people are going to separate themselves from that, it's very different from the conversation on a separation of church and state, because we are influenced by our daily lives, and that includes our traditions, that includes our worldviews. But when you enter a space, your job is not to serve only your community. You serve every constituent, which means you have a moral obligation to make sure that you understand what that means very deeply. And sometimes it is informed by the fact that you come from a certain worldview.
Right. Sahil, I agree with you. I mean, for me, I often think about the golden rule. The golden rule applies to many different religious traditions and none. And it was practiced as far back as 1 billion BCE, before Common Era, by hunters, right? Because the idea is that they needed one another to survive. And so the way in which I approach conversations, or I believe people should approach conversations, is really thinking about the human dignity and worth of everyone that is involved, and not just one particular identity that that person may hold or possess. So I think it's important that people take into account the human dignity. How do you want to be treated in these situations? And so when I see these court cases come up, and I celebrate the win that happened yesterday, at the same time, I was challenged by the fact that there are people that think that because someone loves a certain person, or because they identify a certain way, that they are not included to be a part of a protected class because they are still human beings. And so, like, those are the things that challenge me at times, when people are not thinking from the basic perspective of everyone deserves to be treated equally and to be valued and dignified as human beings. But I guess if you come also from the history of America, where the practice was to dehumanize and to not legitimize the humanity of certain groups, then that will still filter into 2020.
There's one thing that I actually want to address about that. I might get a little in trouble for this. I actually don't like the golden rule anymore.
Interesting.
And the reason why is because it comes from a place of selfishness. Do unto others as you want them to do unto you, which implies that you want them to treat you better so that you can treat them better. And the point is, that's not how you should have a mindset. That's not your narrative. The practice should be, do unto others as you would want done unto yourself. Meaning that if you want yourself to thrive, if you want yourself to receive justice, if you want yourself to be in a place of equity and opportunity, you better damn make sure you do that for other people. Because there is nothing less. We do not deserve anything less in the process.
I agree. And it points to me then to what I refer to as a moral imagination, right? I learned this from a former colleague, that moral imagination is about holding everyone in care, even if you have differences of opinions with that particular individual, that you should hold everyone in the community in care. And so, you know, how do we hold community in care? How do we engage in conversations about religious freedom and hold in care those that have religious beliefs and those that do not? Like, and it points back to the humanity of that person. So yeah, so there's a very interesting spin on how you saw, how you perceive the golden rule, but I still imagine that it's a space where we could all start and hold each other in care. So.
Well, I think I think what you've stated is what I've been kind of taught to believe my entire life, right? That everything comes down to the causes that we make and the effects that come out of it. Not necessarily that we're editing ourselves, we're not being ourselves, or we're not being fully ourselves, we're not being fully present, but realizing that every thought, word, and deed, every action that we take, whether we see it today, tomorrow, or 10 years from now, it inevitably goes out into the universe and ultimately comes back to us. So I think that when you think of things from the perspective of cause and effect, everything that we do or everything that we think or how we act is a cause, then you start to realize okay, maybe that's not a cause that I want to make, not necessarily from the perspective of what I want to get out of it, but just realizing that if all people and their environments are connected, then that's not equitable, and it's just not right. But not everybody sees it. Some people feel like they can outrun it. And I know that we're running short on time. I see Sarah to jump back in.
I would like to direct a question to Charles, and then I'll also say a final question for our other panelists to be thinking about. So Charles, a question for you is, someone said, no one calls themselves a Christian nationalist. So who are we really talking about when we are saying Christian nationalism? Given the work that you and the VJC have done, I'd love for you to sort of define that and really describe it as specifically as you can. And then while he's doing that, a final question for our panelists. How can we all encourage those of us who may be people of faith or atheists and non-theists, how can we encourage our friends who are engaged in religious community? How can we empower them to have religious communities that are fighting for social justice? So while you're thinking about that, Charles, Christian nationalism, what is it? Who is it? They certainly don't call themselves that.
That's a funny question to me because I don't find many racists that call themselves racist. You know, it's like, you don't have to find it. But what we see it as is it could be in policies, you know, your thought process. If you connect with the mantra that no matter what, you're right because of your faith, to me, and you also align that with that's why America is right, then you're a Christian nationalist. I go as far as deep as to say, you know, the whole idea of manifest destiny is a Christian nationalist type thing. The whole idea of that we are a Christian nation goes to saying a Christian nationalist. So it's not just people that call and go around calling themselves that. It's the people that act in this form or this manner. So that's how you identify it in my eyes. The people that hold Christianity over any other religion, they can do it for themselves. But when they try to make that the policy of everybody and how everybody should act and how every law should be in place, then that's your ideal opponent of Christian nationalism. And I don't care if they call themselves that or not. Their policies show that, and their actions toward other people show that.
Thank you. So turning to that final question for our panelists to round out our time together, how do we empower our religious friends to be more engaged in social justice, to push their own communities even to be more engaged in social justice?
I would say people need to speak up. Education is the key, right? You can't begin doing advocacy without education. One of the things that I am grateful for is that, you know, I work with the outreach and engagement team for Americans United, and I see the work that my colleagues are doing to help educate the community, especially youth. I want to shout out Alicia and what she's doing to help mobilize youth on these issues. But also in some of the work that I've done, I've appreciated how seminaries have been intentional about having religious leaders as well as those that are following that path to engage on this topic, to really learn more about religious freedom and why it's important, and why as religious leaders they need to engage in this civic discussion. A lot of times it's theological discussions, but the civic discussion and understanding the importance of religious freedom and protecting church state, and also protecting one's rights, and that's the rights for everyone. And so we all have a responsibility to engage in that and to guard and protect them.
I think one thing that I would suggest, especially to folks who are in the process of learning to become accomplices, as my colleague Charles has emphasized, be in a place of discomfort, because this is a long road of learning. You will make mistakes on the way. You will have a lot to learn. You will have a lot to challenge yourself when it comes to these thoughts and implications, but be ready to grow, be ready to transform, because this is a part of a very long, enduring process that is not just about making up for 450 years of oppression. It's about making sure that this doesn't happen to anyone else ever again.
I think it comes down. I think it comes down to faith, practice, and study. If you really see that as your faith, and try your best to study what you need to study to really understand it, and not just come from a place of supremacy or you know, just lording it over anyone else, but really walking the walk or talking the talk, but like really in thought, word, and deed. You know, practice what you preach, faith, practice, and study.
Sarah, I want to add one more thing. I would say people need to read. There's a book written by Tisa Winger that's called Religious Freedom, the Contested History of an American Ideal. A lot of times people only know the history of religious freedom through the lens of white America. And I think it's important that Tisa brings out a different aspect of history. And so she talks about how indigenous communities and Black Americans have been impacted by religious freedom over time and how religion has been used as a weapon and a tool. So it's important that people read.
Charles, you want to round us out with any thoughts that you have?
You know, I think back to the Christian against Christian nationalism thoughts. And I think one of the things we have to make sure that all of us have blind spots, right? And so we have to think about this mantra of love seeks to understand and not be understood. So if your first action is to try to tear down something in your mind before you even get a chance to listen to it, then there's a barrier there. And we have to learn to work through that barrier. I don't want people to hide behind things. And one of the things I've seen Americans and some of the white nationalists and white evangelicals hide behind is they'll hide behind their faith, they'll hide behind the Bible, and then they will hide behind the American flag, not to address issues. And if you can't address an issue because of those three things, you might need to question how you're living in a pluralistic society, because nothing should block you from addressing the humanity of another person.
Thank you, Charles. And thank you to all of our panelists and AU's own Dr. Sabrina Dent, our senior faith advisor and one of the newest members of the AU team. Thank you so much for joining us and for this rich conversation, and for all of our participants as well. Next week, we'll be taking a dive back into the nitty-gritty of what's happening at the Supreme Court. We just had an incredibly important decision issued yesterday. Some of you had questions about, but what about religious freedom, and how was this going to play out, and how might employers use their religious beliefs to try to opt out of this new law, this new ruling from the Supreme Court on employment non-discrimination. So if that is a question that you're still holding on to, join us next week. We will have two of AU's litigators, our attorneys, who will be talking about all of the cases that are at the Supreme Court, some of which we might get more rulings on before we get back together next Tuesday. So we'll see you a week from today at 3 p.m. Eastern or 12 p.m. Pacific, and want to express some final gratitude for all of our panelists. We will have this presentation up at au.org/summer series within 48 hours. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.